From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
There are about 130 instruments in the Miller collection out of nearly 1,800 that are by Native North and South Americans. And Barry is here today to talk about Native American cording flutes. The ones that we're going to talk about today are from North America in the Miller collection and in Barry's collection as well. And Barry has been down here this week looking at our instruments and doing a database and measurements and sound of them. That's actually part of a bigger project in other museums around the world that have collections of such instruments. And that would include in America, up in Boston at the Museum of Fine Arts, the Metropolitan, Peabody up at Harvard, and private collectors. But the instruments in the Miller collection, it's the largest amount of instruments, Native American instruments, in a public institution. So we're fortunate we have this collection, and we're fortunate we have Barry here today. It's part of Native American Heritage Month, and also there's a flyer being sent around. There's also tomorrow in Jefferson another event called Native by Native, so don't miss that one either, and some more flutes will be there. Thank you. Barry?
My name is Barry Higgins. I'm originally from New Hampshire, from central New Hampshire. My ethnic heritage is Anglo, Caucasian, plus Native American, and in the Native American side it's the Penaku, or Penacook as it's pronounced nowadays, which is from the Merrimack Valley in New Hampshire. How did I get to the flutes? I spent 30 years in the healthcare industry, both as a healthcare provider and as an information systems person, and an executive at a big healthcare system in Western Massachusetts. I've been a musician since I was 11 years old. I started off playing trumpet. It was a single note instrument. When Herb Alpert became unpopular, I moved to guitar, then to keyboards, and then I finally came back to a one note, what I call a one note instrument. We only play one note at a time. And that was the Native American flute. I heard it, it resonated, whether it was something that was DNA that started vibrating when that flute started playing, I don't know. But I got hooked. One of the things that I ran into when I first started playing the flutes were that the instruments were very rudimentary. There were very few people. There were maybe 4 makers within the country that were popularly selling flutes on a more commercial basis. Unfortunately, now it's more like 4,000. They're everywhere. One of the things that has become really popular with the instrument is that it's tuned nowadays to a minor pentatonic scale, and it's a scale that that each one of the notes are harmonic with the other. I'll try not to speak too much music language, unless everybody wants me to. What's the familiarity with? It's okay? Oh, 0. Okay, I'll keep it down. So anyways, all the notes sound harmonious with each other. So it's a very easy instrument for people to learn. So a lot of people who have never had any experience playing an instrument find this flute, and it is an instant love affair. I think what I can do is I can play one of the songs without the what I wanted to do was to start things off, and I don't know if these are going to conflict. No? Okay. This is a piece that's, it's called The Enchanted Forest, but it was written by a Tuscarora fellow, which is part of the Iroquois Confederacy, by the name of Arnold Richardson. And this is my interpretation of that piece. But it's more traditional in its sound because what it's doing is it's mimicking the sounds of nature and birds in the forest. Actually, I do very well by ear, and I'll just listen to something and I'll be able to play it. I don't think this has been written down anywhere. There were a few.
The guy is writing down, is doing writing for multiple instruments and things like Charles Nakai.
Yes, he has his own system. He has his own system of documentation that he created. I'm not a personal fan of it, but we could talk more about it after. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to run through. If you could hold questions until the end. No, that's okay. I didn't make that announcement. We have a lot to cover, and so I want to make sure we get it covered, and then we can stand around and talk a little bit later. I'm going to try to dig into my head and remember my talk. So I'll do the, oh, here's the man. We need to, well, so let me talk a little bit about the instruments. Just about every single tribe had a flute. The flutes varied from region to region. They varied in the materials that were used to produce them, and so it was more of what was prevalent in a particular area that was useful and could be manipulated to create the flute. So, for example, in New England, white cedar was a very soft wood. It was easy to get. It split very well. It was easy to carve out. Another wood that would be used in the Northeast would be sumac, staghorn sumac, and that has a pithy core to it. So they could take out the middle of the wood, and there we go. And then they could enlarge it from that standpoint once it was already started to be hollowed. Down in the South, from about Virginia down and then across the lower United States, river cane was popular, and it's a form of bamboo. It's actually more like looks more like as far as wall thickness and stuff like it. Here's a piece that's untreated. It's thinner walled than bamboo, but it was very popular with any of the southern tribes. As you went up into the plains regions, a lot of the flutes that we found were made of juniper, which is we call that aromatic cedar or eastern red cedar or juniper. It's also fairly easy to carve, and it had a special resonance to it. There's a lot of silica, there's a lot of glass, if you will, inside of the wood. And so it adds a vibration element, almost like a DZ, Japanese DZ, or Chinese DZ, where it uses a membrane to give extra resonance to the sound. You want to speed ahead? Mm-hmm. We did that. We can go by that one. Okay. Well, why don't we pick back up here, and I'll try to connect pieces. Just about every single tribe that had a flute had mythology behind how that flute came to be. So I'm going to tell you the first story here, the Sioux flute story. Everybody likes a story. Well, a long time ago, the young braves got together once a year, and they picked the maidens of the tribe that they wanted to date, if you will, and they had to prove themselves somehow to get the eye and the attention. Well, there was one small young man, but he was very small, and it was very hard for him to get the attention of any of the women there. And so he said he had to do something special. Well, he was a good hunter. Because of his small size, it was easy for him to hunt. And he thought, well, I'll go out and I'll get an elk. I'll bring back an elk. It'll bring back a lot of meat. It'll bring back hides, all kinds of things for the tribe to use. That'll be very special. And so he went off into the forest to hunt the elk. And as he was traveling, he could hear the elk off in the distance. I didn't have And he heard the whistle, and he went following the whistle deeper and deeper and deeper into the forest. Well, the sun started going down, and he knew that he was not going to get that elk. And he knew he couldn't get back to the tribe by the end of the day. So he decided to lay down at the base of a tree. So he lays down at the base of a tree, and during the night, in his dreaming, he hears all these songs that keep singing to him through the night. And when he woke the next day, he heard those same songs, only he was wide awake. And so he went following these sounds deeper and deeper and deeper into the forest. And then he comes to a tree, and he looks up, and there's a woodpecker that's sitting on a branch, and he's pecking holes in the branch. And as the wind blew and the wind blew over the branch, he could hear the sound. And he said to the woodpecker, he said, "May I have that branch?" And so the woodpecker went to the end, took it off, and then the young brave held it in his hands, and it made no sound. And the woodpecker says, the wind has to blow through it. And so he held it in his hand, and he said, "Well, I can't go waving this stick at people. Everyone will run away." So the woodpecker says, "I'll do one more thing for you." So he hopped up on the end of it, and he put another hole, and that's how we have this hole in the end of the flute here. And he said, "Your breath will now be the wind, and you blow your breath through the flute." And sure enough, when he did, out came the music. Well, he was so happy. All the way back to the tribe, he played these songs over and over and over again. And he sat up on the hillside, and up on the hillside he played away. And everyone down below in the tribe said, "Oh my, doesn't the wind sound beautiful today?" And he came down off the hill with his stick, his flute, and he certainly got the attention of his intended maiden, and they lived happily ever after. Okay. As I said before, all tribes had flutes. Most of them also had drums, and I'm pushing the wrong button. They had frame drums, which are handheld drums, usually 1 to 2 skins. Toms, which were smaller, stiffer drums, thicker walled, and right up to the powwow-sized drums that had buffalo skins or elk, some deer, that multiple people could play at the same time. And then in the Iroquois, in the Northeast culture, we had what was called the water drum. And the water drum is a very small drum that uses a wet piece of tanned leather, and it's very popular, especially with the Iroquois culture. Percussion, there were rattles, clappers in Southern California. Clappers were pretty big in the Northeast. There were a few clappers that were bells in the Northwest. They even, when the missionaries came in, some of the native tribes went from the jingle bells to the actual handheld bells. I know a medicine man from the Northwest who uses in his ceremonies, he uses a handbell still. As I said earlier, in geography, the instruments varied with the region in their designs and their materials. Influences, we find that looking at the flutes that there was some pre-contact influence, and by contact I'm talking about the dominant culture within the country, or starting with the Pilgrims. And then post-contact, there were some influences. There's been a lot of speculation, in the National Geographic's genographic study has pretty much come to the conclusion that the Asian markers are present in most of the tribes west of the Mississippi, and that the migration path was in fact over the Bering Land Bridge, down through Alaska, down through California, down into Central America, South America. And so all those DNA markers are there. In the Northeast, way up in the Northeast, we've got some kind of Scandinavian markers in our roots. So there's a speculation on some of the flute designs that are like common down in the Southwest. Did they come along with the DNA, which I'm saying is the pre-contact? And then we have post-contact. For example, the Micmac flute looks a lot like a penny whistle. And the old penny whistles that were played by the ship's cabin boys had a unique look to them. They were short, stout, heavy pieces. And the Micmac Native American flute looks very much like this cabin boy penny whistle. There was a male dominance with the flute. It remains so in traditional use. There's a lot of, you can't encapsulate all Native American culture into one basket. What's good for one tribe is not good for another. In the East, we use, as an offering for blessings or prayers, we'll use, for example, sweetgrass. Very prevalent along our seacoasts. And out west, it's sage. Now, a friend of mine was at a ghost dance, and the ghost dance leader said, "Oh, you should never, ever, ever use sweetgrass." And out here, it's the opposite way. So, you can't put everything all in one culture. For example, in the plains with percussion, women generally aren't allowed to play drum with the men. But in the Iroquois society, which is matriarchal, the women are the ones that play the drums, and the men don't play them. So you have to be careful about grouping everything together. But for the most part, it was a male-dominant instrument. Mary Youngblood, who's a contemporary flutist, was probably the first woman to do some recording with a major recording label. The flutes were generally made for what we call splits. A lot of the flutes in the Miller collection are splits, where they take just what we call a billet, a chunk of wood, and just like Abe Lincoln making split rail fences, cedar is absolutely wonderful for splitting. It comes apart like a jigsaw puzzle, but you put an axe into it and it'll split off into two pieces that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. So we call those splits. Then the two halves are gouged out to make the interior part. Boring, there is one flute within the Miller collection that has been reamed out. Now, whether that's what it is from the end, it's the same way that they would make recorders. It's a more advanced methodology than the splits. And then there's natural cavities, river cane or bamboo, but there it's already hollow. The only thing that you have is the nodes in between. And so to make a two-chambered flute, you just leave one of the nodes remaining inside of the flute. Horns, there were all kinds of horns. We were talking about it this morning that, and you'll see a picture of it later on, but like the Micmac people had a big birch bark. It looked like a megaphone, but it was a moose call, and it was used for hunting. And in the Southwest, they would use even gourds, long-necked gourds, to make flutes, because when they dried out, they were also quite easy to hollow. If you can go ahead. So construction methods, let's see. So we either had the natural bore, it was reamed out, or it was carved. And then they were sealed and bound. There's a lot of confusion about this too. They were never glued together. We didn't have glue, but we had ways to seal it, and that was the optimal thing. A flute, a cylinder that's not sealed will not pronounce the right pitches. It's going to give you the pitch to where the leak is. But what they would do is they would collect sap from the tree, and they would melt it down, and they would make this sticky pitch compound, and they would paint it onto the wood surfaces, and when it was pressed together, it would seal that chamber. But then they had to, now if you look at this flute up here in the case, you notice the top one, it has all these bindings on it. And really all those bindings were meant to hold it together because it was not glued. So that one's a really good example of how it was kept together. Some of them that we've seen in the collection have wire bindings. Some of them have old linen bindings. Some of them have tanned leather, mostly what they call brain tan leather, that hold things together. The flutes were made by body measurements, typically. And the way that you made a flute was that it was as long as from your elbow to your fingers extended. And then you would place your hand or at the end of the wood and extend your thumb, and that's where the sound hole would be. Then you would take your thumb and you set it down on there, and then the exit hole would be 1 thumb width back. And now my hands are a little different than a computer. This is a computer modeled flute. A little bit different, but it would be 1 hand width up would be where the first hole would be, and then it would be 1 thumb width in between each one, and that's where the flute's tuning came from. They didn't have tuners. They didn't know about perfect pitch. Some of them were pretty lucky, but if I've got 38-inch arm length, I have a very long hand, but it's normal width. So my flute's going to come out a little funky compared to somebody who has an average arm length and maybe has a wider hand. So there was a lot of random nature to the flutes and how they came out. And there were some things that came into the making of the flutes that came from oral traditions, and I'll speak about the warble a little bit further on, but that was one of the points. Today, we use natural bores. We still use some river cane. Some of them are reamed out. We call them rifle barreling. Some are carved, or some are used using a modern router to make 2 perfect halves that we glued together with very scientific glue. And as I say, any wood would do nicely. I've made flutes out of maybe over 300 different species of wood. Some of them aren't very good as far as what makes a good flute. And actually, usually it comes down to the prettier it is, the less likely it makes a really good musical instrument. And I'm talking about from a pure musician standpoint. They are highly engineered and modeled nowadays. No more hand measurements. We use computer modeling and physics to design the flutes. There were a couple of different types of flutes. There were notch-blown, very, very early notch-blown flutes, and they were bone whistles. In the Beebe Museum in Maine, there are a number of examples of swan wing-bone flutes. Some of the flutes, the oldest carbon-dated flutes in the world, the Neanderthal flutes, for example, that they found, I think some of them were in Russia. Those were all bone flutes as well, but they were notch-blown. And then there were rim-blown flutes, and those rim-blown flutes were common to the Southwest, and I'll show you a couple of those. And then we had the 2-chambered flute, which is still the basis of the modern design that we have. We had whistles. Generally, they had no playing holes, but those were the ones that were more commonly used in ceremony. The Miller collection also has a number of what we call like grass dance flutes, eagle-blown whistles in the archive that were primarily blown during ceremonies versus played in a musical sense. And then we had the horns like the birch bark moose call. Of the rim-blown style flutes, there are a number of different ones, and I'm going to I'm okay with passing these around, so. But let's. What's that? Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, just be nice to them, everybody. Let's see, here's a Hopi. Basically, we had the Mohawk flute and the number of them. I'm going by the number of holes in the flute. This is a modern Mojave, and this is a much more traditional Mojave flute. This one being made out of mahogany, this one being made out of river cane. The California flute, or in Southern California, it was made out of elderberry. So elderberry is a lot like sumac, and it has a pithy core, which was easy to get out. And it had 5 holes and played a very different scale. And then the Hopi flute has 5 holes, plays a very different scale. And then the Anasazi, this is a traditional Anasazi style flute, not a modern one. And so why don't you go to the next one, and I'll send these off after I talk about them. So this is the pomo flute, and I'll try to make some noise for you. So it's a near diatonic or major scaled flute. It's a straight cylinder. When you look at it, you'll see there's nothing in there, and you could play it from either end. These were generally played with large gourd rattles and the clapsticks. And can somebody remind me like time-wise?
Yeah, 30 minutes.
Oh, great. All right, next please. The Mojave flute, and here's a picture again of one that's a museum piece. I think this one is from the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and then actually this flute here. We're doing a lot of research right now on these flutes because a lot of misinformation is out there. And what's happening in a contemporary sense has very little to do with what's happened in the traditional sense. And this flute this group of flutes is pretty much like that. It plays a major modal scale, and I will play each one of these, but the contemporary one, if you know anything about music, it plays it emphasizes both the first and second octave, whereas the traditional one, it's the second and third octave. And the first octave is very, very hard to get when played in a traditional way. Now, one of the things that's happened with this flute is we went from a flute that was played more in a Middle Eastern style. The flute was played diagonally and like a ney, and it's just blowing off the edge. And the other way is like the Persian ney, which is called interdental, and you basically jam it up into your teeth. I'm not very good at this, but the anthropologists that documented these flutes, they said that the native people made horrible noises with these things. So I guess I'm doing well that way. But that's the kind of sound. Now, what's happened with the instrument is that the contemporary one is played vertically, like a Japanese shakuhachi or a Chinese zao, and it's an angled, notched edge. We did, however, find this style. One was a piece of photographic evidence, one of Carter's pictures, Edward Curtis's photography, and we found a flute in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. We call it the White Crow flute because it's like one of a kind that we've been able to find so far. But here's the sound played vertically, and there's a noticeable difference. It's a smooth, cultured sound, and so that's one of the reasons that it's become so attractive in the modern sense. Is it's a much more pleasing instrument when it's played vertically. However, traditionally, this does not represent the tradition. So let me pass those around. Same thing happened with the Hopi flute. Same thing happened with the Anasazi, or now the preferred name is the ancient Pueblo. We've done things to make the finger holes match people rather than the way that the flutes were made. Again, the Anasazi flute wasn't played vertically. It was played either diagonally. And the holes are really hard to reach, but any one of the artifacts that have been documented have the wide holes. I'm going to play it a little. I'm going to cheat a little bit. And that horrible sound is the Anasazi. And the Hopi flute was the same as the Anasazi or ancient Pueblo, but the only thing is they skipped one hole. And so it was 5-hole, but it played exactly the same scale. So, anyways, I'll pass the Hopi and the Anasazi around. These are pictures of the first Anasazi-style flutes. These are from the Broken Flute Cave dig. Okay, we can skip this. This is like the Academy Awards where you can move ahead. All right, we're going to go into the two-chambered flutes. There was somewhat of an evolutionary path to these instruments, or progression in designs. It's like the first transverse flute and now when we look at the silver flute, it's an entirely different character. This is a Papago flute, and what it did was it was one of the first fipple flutes, where we had a whistle mechanism, and they put 3 holes. There was a traditional element to it. Now this is a model, because this is one of the flutes from the MFA in Boston, and it was cracked, so it didn't play. So what we did was we reproduced the bore diameters and wall thicknesses, et cetera, to come up with what the pitches would be. So even though it's black walnut, this is what it would have sounded like. But what you did was you had the little channel, but you put your finger over the top of it to create. And so the next progression, if you would, and the next door neighbors, the Pima flute, and this is one from the Miller collection here, and this is basically a model that's in progress of that flute. Only thing I did was, when we measured these pitches, you see these are very, very small holes, so the flute was very, very quiet. And what I did was I made them the same pitch, but I lowered them in the position on the bore to make them a more robust sound. So that was the adaptation that I did. But this flute, it was a kind of interesting flute. It's like a tabor pipe. Anybody know what a tabor pipe is? It's popular in the Celtic culture. And it only had 2-3 holes, and you play drum at the same time. So this flute worked kind of the same way. It was a one-hander. It only had 3 holes, and you could I can't drum anyway, but but as you can see, one-handed, four notes, you could come up with a piece of music. Most of the music that came from oral songs. So in other words, if they sang it, they tried to mimic it on the flute. Sometimes that was successful, sometimes it wasn't. There's a modern contemporary artist by the name of Kevin Locke who is Sioux. He sings the songs and then he plays them on flute. And funny thing is they don't sound anything the same, because what it is he's trying to find the closest note available on the flute to the traditional oral songs. This is a picture, but I'll send around this one as well. This is the 2-chambered flute cut in half the other way, so you can see what's inside. But what happens is the air comes in through a smaller mouthpiece into this chamber. And in this chamber, the air slows down and the air smooths out. Then it rises up over what we call the plug and under the bird. So the bird, for the most part, is an artistic piece except for this face and this underside. And basically the air comes across and just like a whistle hits an edge and it begins oscillating the air, and then sine waves come down the tube. And wherever you have an open hole, that terminates the length of the flute. So you have all the holes closed. We're talking about a pitch that's generated on this tube length. As we open this one, now our tube is only that long, so that when we get up here, we have a high pitch and our tube is only that long. So, as I said, today we model everything by computer modeling using the laws of physics and the speed of sound. This is one from the Miller collection, the mother of invention. This is a gun barrel. It was already bored out. So, why not use the obvious? One of the things that we found, however, was that, we knew it was a later flute because it was machine drilled. So it was, somebody had the pipe, cut it off, drilled the holes for them, whatever, and then, because this is very traditional here. This is a piece from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which is kind of like this top one here, which is very, very traditional. And you can walk around after and take a peek at some of these a little closer. But this is a really, really beautiful piece. And we were talking this morning about if I'm going to make a model of any of them, it'd probably be this one. Because it holds a bunch of secrets that we can't find out because it can't be played. But, you know, in the challenge of getting the flutes sealed up, this flute, as well as one in the Miller collection, they used basically the lining of the intestine, the membrane, just like a sausage casing. They would slide it over the wood, and then when the skin shrank, it would pull the two pieces together and keep it bound and seal it up. And then you can see this flute. This was a really heavily played flute. They actually wore the binding off. This is a reproduction of that flute minus the entrails. So, and it's interesting because one of the things that it does is very, very traditional, and we'll get to that in a second. Animal spirits. Lots of times, beyond what we call the bird that sits up on top, they would have animal images on the open ends, and this is a canvas-back duck from the Miller collection. Here's a close reproduction of it, and we can send that one around. I'm not going to send this one around, so I'll just hold it up. But here's a modern, and basically this is a decoy quality carving on the end of the flute. Okay, you can go ahead. Here's a sample of some of the whistles. This is the eagle bone whistle. This is a whistle made out of buffalo horn, and it's more like an ocarina. And here's that great big moose call I was saying. It's made out of birch bark, and it looks more like a megaphone. Today, as I said, we do things a lot different, and we use the math. And again, we understand the physics of sound, and we apply the physics of sound to the flute. So if I played, and this is a wonderful voiced example, we recorded this one this morning, of a very traditional sound. And but I mean, that's a 1925, probably somewhere around early 1900s sounding flute. But you compare that to a modern physics. So an awful lot has changed in the quality of the sound by understanding the physics. As I said, I was an IT person, and part of my career was writing software as well. And so I created a program so everybody can make flutes a lot easier. I just typed in all the formulas. Keys, typically they were made by body dimension, so you can probably envision that the span of keys that were played, or different ranges of the flutes, was fairly narrow. And if we look at the Miller collection, I mean, most of them are what we would consider nowadays middle-sized. And there were a few exceptions where there were some very large flutes. And one of the things that we found out about some of these flutes, and there's kind of a mirroring of what's happening today, is that the pretty flutes are not the ones that play. And this is really what we've classified as what we call a tourist flute. When Miller was making his collection, and he sent people out to help him procure the instruments. And one of the problems is that once a particular vendor, if you will, knew that Miller would buy the flutes, he'd go out and have somebody make up a bunch of them. But Miller caught on to it very quickly. You can read in his journals where he's got documentation to some of these folks saying, I don't want the same flute makers, all from the same tribe, all from the same person. I want diversity to the collection. And that's one of the most important parts of the Miller collections is its diversity. But nowadays, we don't have that narrow range. I make 35 different key models of flutes. I make everything from a little teeny tiny thing to one that's 5.5 feet tall. This is kind of a joke. I actually made one 7.5 feet long, but you can't play it. It's just an overblown thing, almost like a Fujara. Octave play, typically they only played one octave. 4 or 5 notes, one octave, that was it. Now we're talking octave and 3/4. You cannot change the embouchure on this flute. So you can't improve things as far as octave range by changing the position of your mouth as you can with a silver flute. You can do it with the rim blowns, but we make for people who can't reach, something that's this long, and you have a little 4'11" woman who wants to play a bass flute. You have to get creative with the holes as to where they're going to go. So mathematically, there are some places we can shift them, but we can only shift them so far. So what they do is they put side mouthpieces on them nowadays, almost like a bassoon extension, so that they can be played by people with shorter arms and accommodate some of the reach issues. There were some drones that have become popular. Drones are not North American Indian instruments. They're Mesoamerican, most commonly Mesoamerican from Central America, South America. A lot of people have tried to claim ownership of the drones, but archaeologically we have found none, other than a couple of northwestern train whistle style things, but they weren't flutes. Now they make flutes that play in harmony, like dual chambered ocarinas, have the tunings. We can tune because we know the physics. We can tune them any way you want them, and people can make them look Indian. So the finishings, it's amazing what people will put onto flutes nowadays. The music that goes out with these instruments usually falls into 3 categories. One that's remained traditional, where the oral songs are played to the flute's best fit. And that's why I was talking about Kevin Locke's music, where he tries to get as close as he possibly can to the oral songs. And then there's a contemporary traditional where people like Arnold Richardson in that first piece I played when I started The Enchanted Forest, they'll play nature sounds in the background, water running, crickets, owls, wind blowing, loons calling. And they'll use a lot of ambient sounds and simple percussion, whether it just be some rattles or a drum or something. And then we have the very contemporary or new age stuff. And here we're using concert tune instruments. And we're trying to play over multiple octaves and different scales. And it can be anywhere from electronic instruments to a full orchestration. Carlos Nakai has a wonderful CD out. If you like any of his stuff, it's called Voices or Inner Voices, one of those two. and he plays with a string symphony. It's absolutely gorgeous. In my mind, it's gorgeous. And then he has some stuff where he plays with a jazz band. So the instruments are getting used in a lot of different genres now. Here's two different things. The first one we're going to, you got a mouse on that thing? Okay, we're going to try this, see if it works. Anybody recognize it? Well, I wrote it up. You all win. That's a little snippet from Alan Mills's recording of the Huron Carol, and it's sung in the Hurons ask now to go back to their traditional name, which is Windot, and here's a contemporary version. So it's played with the flute. Somebody's got jingle bells going, they've got a guitar going, and if you go to the next slide, it'll stop it. Modern archive instruments and recordings. One of the things that we're working on, and one of the reasons that I'm down here right now, is to get a handle on the instruments. As I said, there's a lot of misinformation that's been going around on this flute. Why is the information? Because a lot of the contemporary information is being spread by a much wider base than the traditional, because most of the things done in our traditional were oral based, and if you don't have storytellers, the story doesn't continue. So I'm here in part to become one of the storytellers, and I have some people that do things on websites and stuff. There's a very good website called Fluteopedia, and his idea was he was going to make a Wikipedia for Native American flute, and actually it works pretty good. But these flutes are represented in museums worldwide. The real sorry fact is that more of these flutes exist outside of this country than there is in the country. Why is that? Because Native American artwork, and it's considered part of the artwork, is very, very popular in Europe. I was asked once to go over and perform and speak in Europe. And they said, "Oh, you have regalia?" And I said, "No, I don't have regalia." And they said, "Oh, well, people want to see an Indian." So I very specifically downplay the stereotype Indian representation. I have a Nipmuc friend who is part Afro-American and Nipmuc, and he's very dark-skinned. And then I have a friend named Joe Firecrow, who is 32nd Northern Cheyenne, and he looks very plainsy. And then I'm just this white mix, and I look very northeastern. And so I've got a picture of the three of us together, and I got a little subtitle on it that says, "What color's your Indian?" So we come in all different shapes and sizes. So it's very popular for stuff over in Europe. Private collections. Do you know who one of the biggest collectors of Native American flutes is? John Boy from the Waltons. What's his name? Anyways.
Richard Thomas.
Yes, Richard Thomas. Yeah, he's a very, very big collector. I have a flute that I sold to Pierce Brosnan. Pierce Brosnan did this movie called Gray Owl, and he got enamored with the Native American culture, and one of the things that he got enamored with was the flute. So 007's got one of my flutes. But these private collections, a lot of auction houses will sell this stuff as Native American artwork, and they go into some glass case in somebody's office, living room, basement, vault, private vault. We never hear anything more about them. A lot of the information that's been spread around in the contemporary world has come from a very small sample size. And so that's why collections of 100+ instruments all at once is so important to us, because what it's doing is, anybody who's done any kind of statistical analysis is you need to have a reasonable number to come up with reasonable conclusions about things. And that hasn't happened yet to date. So, for example, there's a lot of Winnebago examples that are in the Miller collection. So by the time we're done, we're going to be able to make some reasonable comments about the Winnebago flute. Its scalar structure, how they were made, etc. And we're going to be able to do that. We'll probably be able to have enough to look at the ones the folks that are within the Sioux Nation, the Lakota, the Dakota, Ogallala, all those different folks, and we'll have some reasonable numbers. There are a number of internet collections. One of the problems that we have there is accessibility. Lots of people say, we have it, but we're only going to let some high-end researcher come in and look at them. But what we're doing is we're kind of closing down the information flow by doing such a thing. And one of the problems we have is finding them even in the collections. So what we've done is we've put out, I think if you jump to the next one, we put out word within the flute community that if somebody comes across an instrument, whether they're visiting a museum, we almost have like a flute hotline that says, these flutes are present in XYZ location. One of the other things we're doing is we're putting together what we call a historical flute database. And actually, Carolyn, this is what I was talking about last night. And what we're doing is we're identifying the location of the collection and all the important information. This is a relational database model. Who is reviewing the instrument, curator notes as well as reviewer notes. And then we get into the very specifics of measurements of all these different parameters. And here we're taking pictures, there's images, and then there's audio files. We've been doing audio recordings of all these, and I'll show you in a second here on why that's important. We're down here, we're documenting the pitches and hole locations, so we can get an idea if across a given subgroup of tribes, whether or not there's any. We're out of time. All right, quick flash. There's a Cheyenne flute. This is this one here in this collection. If you want to take a peek at it, go ahead. This is one from MFA. This is a very, very unusual flute. And afterwards, you want questions. Why we pretty much covered that. Just FYI, if you go to Smithsonian Folkways site, you can listen to some of these little snippets of the music recordings. Some of the things that we're doing on a scientific basis, we're looking at spectral analysis. This is investigating a sound that some of the flutes make called a warble, and it's very different from vibrato. It's a phase inversion of the harmonics, but I can demonstrate that afterwards if you've got a second. Go ahead. This is what we were talking about with the looking at and understanding how the flutes were actually played. And Some of the things that we need to do is we need to make replicas. For example, this flute will never play. So if we make a replica of it, we'll have a better understanding of it. And Askame is a Abenaki word, and that's our language. Root is Abenaki, and it means always and forever. And I can't play it for you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.